Every single day, Russia feeds hundreds, if not thousands, of its soldiers into the Ukraine war meat grinder. Those soldiers are chewed up, spat out, and in many cases will never make it off the battlefield where Ukraine's drones, artilleries, and mines tear them to shreds. For any other attacking nation in a war, this would be a sign of catastrophic strategic failure. But for Russia, it's all part of the Kremlin plan. Catastrophic Russian losses have been revealed, but the Kremlin is still claiming that the Ukraine war is going according to plan. On October 14th, Euromaidan Press published an article in which it revealed figures provided by the UK's Ministry of Defence, or MOD. The numbers don't reflect well on Russia's battle plan in Ukraine. According to the MOD, Russia has suffered a staggering 332,000 casualties so far in 2025. Those numbers run up to October 12th per the MOD's data. So assuming that we can count October as half a month, this number alone means that Russia is losing just under 35,000 of its soldiers monthly in the Ukraine war. And it gets worse. Those 332,000 add to Russia's losses prior to 2025, bringing the grand total of Russian casualties up to 1.118 million since Vladimir Putin launched his full-scale invasion back in February 2022. These MOD numbers roughly align with those provided by Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, though the latter has a slightly higher estimate. It puts the number at around 1.125 million, though a 7,000 soldier difference doesn't seem like much to quibble about. Granted, 7,000 is about the size of Estonia's standing military, which Global Firepower says has 7,700 active personnel. But that's nothing to the Kremlin. 7,000 dead or injured soldiers is all in a week's work for Russia, as you'll discover in a moment. The takeaway here is simple. Russia isn't just losing soldiers, it's losing entire armies. Any other invading nation that saw 1.1 million of its soldiers die for the cause, with 332,000 of those casualties in about 3/4 of a year, would have given up by now. At the very least, it would have declared a ceasefire or come up with some sort of plan B, but not Russia. Far from being a national travesty, this massive casualty rate is all part of the plan. For now, let's come back to the MOD's figures. Sharing its figures on X, the MOD breaks Russia's casualty rate down into daily figures for the last couple of months. It notes that Russia lost an average of 950 soldiers per day in September, which was a moderate increase over the figures seen in August. That, surprisingly, is good news for Russia. September 2025 saw the country's second lowest casualty rate since April 2024, the MOD says, with August 2025 offering the lowest. Euromaidan Press adds that September and August mark sharp declines from the spring of 2025. In March and April, Russia was dealing with a daily casualty rate of around 1,300, the outlet reports, with April alone seeing it lose 36,000 soldiers. September marked a 27% decline from that 2025 high point. But the good news hasn't lasted for Russia. The gradual rise seen in September has continued in October. However, Russia's casualty rate in October 2025 has been steadily increasing, surpassing 1,000 daily casualties every day from the 5th of October through to 12th of October, the MOD reports. So it looks like Russia is getting back to its heavier losing ways as we approach the end of 2025. And when we say heavier, we really mean it. More of Russia's soldiers are dying than ever. Casualties alone don't reveal the true story of Russia's massive manpower losses, because the term casualties covers everybody who is killed, injured, captured, or otherwise taken out of the war. To get the true picture of what's happening to Russia's forces right now, we need to look at the Russian military's ratio of dead to injured. First, some context. Back in World War II, death-to-injury ratios varied depending on the country and the battles it participated in. The DePay Institute says that for the Soviet army, the devastating fight against the invading Nazi army in Kursk saw it hit a ratio of 2.29 injuries to every 1 death during the first week of the battle, followed by a slightly better 2.68 injuries to each death a week later. Other ratios are comparable or better. The UK, for instance, flitted between ratios of 1.67 to 1 and 4.59 to 1 when fighting in Ardennes. The US tended to stick around the 5 injuries for every death mark. Bear in mind that World War II was among the most brutal conflicts seen in the history of mankind. Modern wars tend to have more favorable ratios thanks to advances in medicine and militaries actually caring about evacuating their wounded soldiers. The US campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan provide some solid evidence of that. In Afghanistan, the US had 4.5 wounded per death, while Iraq saw a much higher 7.3 injuries per death. In the latter case, that means that only 1 of every 8 or so soldiers reported as casualties had actually died. We're sharing all of this contextual information with you for a reason. Russia's wounded-to-dead ratio is even worse than the Soviet army had during the fight for Kursk. On October 13th, Politico reported on a joint report between Mediazona and the BBC. That report confirmed Russian losses during the first 8 months of 2025, and it drew a remarkable conclusion. Due to a lack of a normal system of evacuating the wounded from the battlefield, there are only 1.3 wounded soldiers per 1 dead. This signals a low level of survival of the wounded who are poorly trained in tactical medicine and are usually abandoned without help after injury, the report claims. That throws Russia's casualty figures into an entirely new light. If the country is now losing around 1,000 soldiers per day in October, that means almost half of those casualties are deaths. These are soldiers who are never going to be able to return to fight another day for Putin, meaning they absolutely have to be replaced. Russia isn't just losing soldiers to injury, it's watching its soldiers die on the battlefield, literally. With no real evacuation plans in place, the Kremlin is happily sacrificing the lives of soldiers who could have been saved if Russia were waging anything that even remotely resembles what we know to be a modern war. Russia's wounded-to-dead ratio is worse than the Battle of Kursk in World War II, which still stands as the single largest battle in the history of warfare. But perhaps that battle helps us figure out why this is all part of Russia's plan. As devastating as the Battle of Kursk was for the Soviet Union, it still managed to win the fight. It prevented Germany from launching the major offensive operations it had planned on the Eastern Front, and to many, the battle ended up being the turning point in the war. Right now, we're seeing Russia dealing with a worse wounded-to-dead ratio than even that battle saw, and that may be because Russia believes it can achieve victory in Ukraine through sheer volume of manpower alone. But more on that later in the video. For now, it seems like things are getting even worse on the casualty front for Russia. On October 14th, United 24 media reported that Ukraine reported 190 combat engagements with Russian troops across the entire front line on October 14th alone. Those encounters didn't end well for Russia. Ukraine reported that Russia's military lost 1,200 troops in a single day, along with 5 tanks, 29 artillery systems, 145 vehicles, and 390 unmanned aerial vehicles. Ukraine also conducted many strikes against Russia, the outlet reports, with a particular focus on Russia's command posts and equipment. Over the past day, the Defense Forces' aviation, missile forces, and artillery have struck 7 areas of concentration of personnel and equipment, 3 command posts, and 2 artillery pieces of the Russian invaders, a general staff report states. So not only is Ukraine causing massive casualties for Russia, but it's also targeting the types of infrastructure that Russia needs to organize its future assaults. The logic here is simple. Every command post taken down leads to a less organized Russian assault in the future. And when an assault is disorganized, more Russian casualties are the inevitable result. You may have noticed something else here. The MOD figures we shared earlier said Russia was losing 1,000 soldiers daily during October. On October 14th, Russia lost 200 more than that in a single day, which suggests that the already grim figures for the month are only going to get worse for Russia. This is a far cry from what seemed to be Russia learning a lesson from its massive casualty rate during the late summer and early fall. The casualties were below 1,000 per day in August and September. There seemed to be a hint of a downward trend developing. But no, we're halfway through October and Russia is right back to feeding over 1,000 soldiers per day into the meat grinder, showing us that it has no real alternative strategy for achieving victory in Ukraine. But that's the point. Russia doesn't have a plan B because it believes that plan A is working as it's supposed to. That much was made clear on October 10th, when Russia launched a massive airstrike against Ukraine. United 24 media says in the wake of that strike, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that it was satisfied with the outcome of the strikes on Ukraine, adding that all of the targets it wanted to hit had been destroyed. That may have been the case. However, October 10th was also a day when Russia, once again, lost over 1,000 of its soldiers. RBC Ukraine notes that the Ukrainian military's October 11th report covering the previous day revealed that Russia had lost 1,060 soldiers on the day that the Russian Defense Ministry was lauding its own strikes. Russia doesn't even care if the rest of the world is paying attention to its massive casualty rate. It's happy with its airstrikes and pays so little mind to the country's massive casualty count, specifically because what's happening on the ground is going according to plan. Putin has made this kind of claim before. Back in January 2023, after his initial special military operation had failed and Russia found itself embroiled in an attritional war, Putin claimed that what the world was seeing in Ukraine was what Russia wanted it to see. The dynamics are positive. Putin said at the time. Everything is developing within the plan of the Defense Ministry and the General Staff, and I hope that our fighters will please us more than once again with the results of their combat work. By this point in the war, Russia appeared to have hit the 100,000 casualties mark and was veering very close to 150,000 soldiers lost. By March, it would surpass that number, and as we've seen, it's added around 1 million since then. This has been Putin's plan all along. So when the Kremlin says that the Ukraine war is going according to plan, it isn't lying. Russia has made the mass death of its own soldiers a key part of its strategy, in lieu of using the far more modern combined assault approach that would have led to a far lower casualty rate. According to plan may seem strange to any other country that wouldn't be willing to sacrifice several armies' worth of soldiers for a single goal. But for Russia, it's par for the course because attrition, on its own side as well as the enemy's, has always been the Russian way. That's according to the national interest, which says that what is happening in Ukraine aligns closely with how Russia has used its forces during many conflicts of the past. The Russian way of war, so to speak, weaponizes its historically enormous numbers of available troops to achieve success on the battlefield, the outlet said back in April. That's precisely what we've seen in Ukraine. On the ground, at least, Russia has engaged in a strategy that sees it endlessly replenish its forces as Ukraine cuts them down. The same goes for Russia's equipment. What matters to the Kremlin isn't that its soldiers and equipment are being destroyed in Ukraine. That's an expected consequence of the Russian approach to war. The only thing that really matters is that those soldiers and equipment are forcing Ukraine to expend ammunition, to lose people. The slow crawl deeper into Ukraine is being made possible by sheer numbers alone. Going back to World War I, and Russia threw millions of men against the Austro-Hungarian and German forces, the national interest says. During the next World War, Joseph Stalin mobilized the Soviet Union to an unprecedented degree, leading to situations like the Battle of Kursk. Russia is believed to have lost 800,000 soldiers compared to Germany's 200,000 casualties in that battle. But the Battle of Kursk is still seen as one of the great Russian victories. For any other country, that sheer scale of loss would be a catastrophe, a military-ending event that would leave it so weakened that an invading force would be able to do serious damage in future battles. For Russia, those kinds of losses are just part of the plan. And Ukraine proves that Russia takes the same attritional approach when it's on the offense as it does when it's defending. In June, The Telegraph's David Blair published a piece discussing Russia's approach in Ukraine up to that point. His article included an interesting graphic. At the time, it was believed that 250,000 Russian soldiers had died out of a total of 950,000 casualties. Those numbers were recorded after a little over 3 years of warfare. For context, the graphic shows that 58,220 American soldiers died in the 8-year Vietnam War, showcasing how outdated Russia's ground offensive was even over half a century ago. Those numbers conjure an image of Putin casting the entirety of his first invading army into a furnace, then gathering another and doing the same, over and over again, Blair wrote in June. And he isn't wrong. That's exactly what Russia has done, and like the National Interest article, Blair says that Putin's adherence to Russia's history rather than the modern ways of doing war is to blame. He says that the Russian president's frame of reference for what warfare should be doesn't seem to come from any conflict that occurred after 1945. Instead, Putin is steeped in the history of what Russians call the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet Union's epic struggle against Hitler's invasion between 1941 and 1945. It seems that World War II is the model for Russia's approach to Ukraine. That, combined with Putin's callous disregard for the numbers of soldiers Russia is losing, explains how the MOD's figures are what Russia claims them to be, all part of the plan. It's just a plan that makes no sense to any modern military because armies are no longer built to fight the way that Russia is fighting. That's not just on the strategic level either. Western militaries don't treat their soldiers with what Blair calls the cold indifference that Putin and his Kremlin cronies show to Russia's troops. Putin is willing to see the suffering. He's fine with Russia experiencing more casualties than practically any other war has seen since the end of World War II. The question has to be asked, why? Part of the answer for why everything is going according to plan, from the Russian perspective, is that Putin's forces are making gains. They're not impressive gains by any stretch of the imagination. However, they do exist. On October 8th, Reuters reported that Putin claims that Russia has managed to capture about 1,930 square miles of Ukraine in 2025 so far. Assuming Putin is telling the truth, which is a big assumption to make, that would amount to about 1% of Ukraine, bringing the total that Russia has captured up to nearly 20% of the country, Reuters claims. In Putin's mind, holding a fifth of the country is evidence that his plan is working. Never mind that the vast majority of those gains were made during the early weeks of the war, which saw Russia capture plenty of territory before Ukraine pushed it back. To the Kremlin, 20% in just over 3.5 years is still 20%. It's proof that the price being paid in Russian soldiers' blood, though heavy, is worth paying. However, there is another reason why Putin is so willing to continue with the Russian plan. Right now, Putin might not be looking to capture all of Ukraine. Instead, he only wants Russia to capture enough of the territory so that Putin has leverage in future peace talks. Putin has constantly stalled peace talks since they began earlier in 2025, and he is doing that for a reason. On August 16th, in the wake of Putin's Alaska meeting with US President Donald Trump, The Guardian revealed that Putin had made Russian control over Luhansk and Donetsk one of his demands. For a ceasefire to even occur in Ukraine, the front lines would have to be frozen, Putin said, indicating that these two regions in particular are what he really wants. And it's for Luhansk and Donetsk that Russia is still grinding through its troops. Everything is going according to plan for Russia because it's making slow progress through these two regions. Every square mile gained, no matter how slowly, amounts to more leverage for Putin. His goal right now seems to be for Russia to occupy Luhansk and Donetsk so completely that Ukraine will be forced to cede them as part of any future peace. Until that occupation is completed, the plan will stay in place. Russia will dedicate many more hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of its soldiers to the cause. Their loss will be worth it in Putin's mind, because every casualty takes him closer to etching himself into the annals of history as the Russian leader who returned Ukraine to its rightful owners. It's a twisted outlook, and it may end up being this very Russian plan that undoes Russia. In April, George Barros of the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, spoke to the New York Post. He said that the combination of Russia's massive losses and the enormous amounts of money the country is shelling out for its soldiers can't last. The system for generating fighters worked for 2.5 years, but it's starting to fail, Barros claimed. Russia is constrained by the laws of economics, scarce resources, and there isn't an endless manpower resource in Russia. One ISW report adds that the major economic problems being caused by Russia's high casualty rate are likely to mature within another 12 to 18 months. That's right around the end of 2026, and it means that Russia's plan may be running on a deadline. Can the Kremlin really get what it wants out of Ukraine by that point? Or does everything going according to plan mean nothing when the plan was faulty from the start? Some see Russia's plan as a strategic catastrophe that's more likely to crush Russia than achieve victory in Ukraine. With scores of soldiers dead and an economy on the brink, Putin's war is crushing Russia and it's just getting started. Find out more in our video and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of Russia's terrible casualty rate in Ukraine. And thank you as always for watching.